Imagine being praised for your beauty, trained like royalty, dressed in silks, taught music, poetry, and philosophy, yet knowing deep down that none of it was for your own future. Not for your success, freedom, or even happiness. It was to please someone else, someone far more powerful who owned you the way someone might own a painting or a prized pet. That was the tragic fate of thousands of young boys across ancient China, plucked from poverty and turned into male concubines. Not many people know these stories because they were quietly erased, covered up by official records that spoke volumes about female concubines, but barely whispered about their male counterparts. And here's the heartbreaking part. They weren't even considered people. They were property. The tale of male concubines in ancient China isn't just a historical footnote. It's a deeply unsettling window into a world where beauty was a curse, obedience was survival, and growing old meant becoming disposable. For over 2,000 years, through dynasty after dynasty, this practice thrived. Behind the majestic palaces, the Confucian virtue scrolls, and the elaborate poetry of emperors, existed a secret trade in young boys whose only crime was being beautiful and smart enough to be noticed. Most people associate concubinage with women, but that's just half the story. Because right alongside them, sometimes even receiving more attention and education, were boys sold by their own families, some as young as 8. It wasn't rare. In fact, in many regions and periods, it was considered completely normal. Emperors, nobles, merchants, and even monks kept male concubines, and it wasn't always out of affection or romance. These boys were tools of pleasure, tokens of status, and sometimes weapons in political games. How did this happen, and why didn't anyone stop it? The roots go deep. During times of famine or collapse, desperate families had to make impossible choices. Do you let your children starve, or do you sell one to survive? And oddly enough, sons were often sold before daughters, not because boys were less valued, but because male concubines could command a much higher price. These boys weren't going to work in the fields or help around the house. They were being groomed for elite buyers who wanted companions that could entertain, converse, and seduce. And what made it even more heartbreaking was the way entire communities began to normalize the process. In some villages, the arrival of a talent scout wasn't met with resistance. It was treated like a strange opportunity. Mothers would scrub their sons' faces clean, smooth their hair, and present them like offerings, hoping they might fetch a good price. Some families even rehearsed what their sons should say to appear more charming or intelligent. Over time, it wasn't just desperation fueling this practice. It became a twisted form of ambition. If a boy was chosen, the family might receive enough silver to feed everyone for months or arrange marriages for their daughters. It was survival economics layered with silent grief. Behind every beautiful boy who left was a mother who wept, a father who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes, and a community that watched silently as innocents walked away in silk-bound sandals. Talent scouts, known chillingly as human teeth, roamed the countryside like wolves in silk robes. They weren't looking for strong backs or clever minds for labor. They were hunting for porcelain skin, symmetrical bone structure, gentle voices, and graceful posture. Intelligence mattered too, but only if it came wrapped in a beautiful shell. Families barely surviving would hand over their sons in exchange for silver coins and contracts written in language no one in the village could understand. And just like that, the boys were gone, forever in many cases. Now, what came next was something that resembled a twisted version of an elite finishing school. The boys were stripped of their birth names and given new poetic titles. Things like Precious Jade or Autumn Moon. Their heads were shaved, they were dressed in silk and trained in everything from calligraphy and music to massage and philosophy. Not because anyone cared about their development, but because the men who owned them wanted someone who could dazzle at dinner and perform like a theater puppet on command. And if any of these boys dared to show sadness, resistance, or homesickness, the punishment was immediate: starvation, beatings, public humiliation, sometimes even worse. What made it even more tragic was that these reactions, crying, flinching, longing for home, weren't seen as signs of pain or trauma. They were labeled as disobedience. Trainers treated human emotion like a flaw to be corrected. Some boys were forced to kneel on sharp stones for hours, their knees bloodied and raw. Others were locked in dark rooms without food or water, their only company being silence and fear. In rare cases, boys were made to watch as others were punished, a chilling reminder of what could happen if they stepped out of line. There were no safe spaces, no moments of comfort, only a daily lesson in submission. Some adapted by becoming emotionally numb, while others faked smiles so well they began to forget what real happiness felt like. The goal wasn't just to make them obedient, it was to erase their spirit completely, because a broken boy was easier to control, easier to mold, and far less likely to run. Isn't it wild to think that something so openly cruel could exist side by side with teachings about virtue and family honor? Here's where it gets even darker. The training was brutal. Most boys didn't survive it. Only about 60% of those bought as male concubines made it through the grueling preparation to become a polished possession. The rest? They died during training, either from malnutrition, exhaustion, or simply heartbreak, and were buried in unmarked graves. Their families never heard from them again. But for those who survived, daily life wasn't freedom. It was performance. From the moment they woke up, they had to start the show. Hours spent on grooming, makeup, choosing clothes that would please their master. They weren't assigned chores like other servants. Their job was simple: be ready. At any moment, the master might want a poem recited, a shoulder massage, a philosophical debate, or something more intimate. Their rooms were beautiful cages, lavishly decorated, sure, but the windows had bars, the doors locked from the outside. And competition? Oh, it was vicious. These boys didn't bond, they battled. Masters liked to pit them against each other, offering rewards for the most pleasing performance and punishments for those who failed. Older concubines became twisted gatekeepers, abusing younger ones to keep their own fading value intact. Friendships were dangerous. Trust was deadly. It wasn't just physical survival anymore, it was psychological warfare. Can you imagine living every single day knowing that the second you aged out of beauty, you'd be discarded like trash? And aging came fast. By their early 20s, most male concubines were considered past their prime. The constant stress, poor nutrition, and psychological trauma aged them quickly. There were no graceful exits. Unlike female concubines who might bear children and gain household influence, male concubines had no such path, no future. Once the beauty faded, they became invisible, or worse, expendable. Some turned to opium, others to self-harm. A terrifying number didn't survive long past their usefulness. Suicide was rampant, but it was usually covered up, rebranded as illness or accidents to preserve the household's honor. After all, nothing must tarnish the reputation of the master. In the imperial courts, things got even more twisted. Emperors didn't just keep male concubines, they sometimes fell head over heels obsessed. One of the most famous stories involves Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty and his male concubine Dong Xian. It was said that one morning the emperor awoke to find Dong Xian sleeping on his robe. Rather than disturb him, the emperor cut off the sleeve, giving birth to the famous phrase, the cut sleeve, a poetic euphemism for male love. Dong Xian rose to unprecedented power. He held titles, wealth, influence. His family prospered like royalty. But when the emperor died unexpectedly at just 26, Dong Xian's world crumbled. Stripped of everything, he was ordered to die. Rather than face humiliation and torture, he took his own life. A meteoric rise and an even faster, crueler fall. And that wasn't even the most extreme case. Emperor Jingde of the Ming Dynasty didn't want just one favorite. He wanted dozens. He had a whole palace section, the leopard quarter, dedicated to housing his male companions. They weren't just bedfellows. These young men were his party crew, his hunting companions, even his war advisors. Their influence was massive, and so was the corruption. Their whispers sparked military campaigns and shaped policies, and unsurprisingly, it ended in disaster. Even the Qing dynasty, which officially tried to crack down on the practice, wasn't free of it. Emperors still kept male favorites. They were just more discreet about it. And why not? Society had become so desensitized that no one batted an eye when Confucian scholars who preached morality kept concubines at home, or when monks who vowed celibacy used donations to fund private companions. The hypocrisy was everywhere. What's even more disturbing is how these boys were erased from history. Many were buried in unmarked graves. Their names were struck from records, their stories silenced, and today only fragments remain. Stories recovered through memoirs, scattered court documents, and poems that dared to hint at forbidden affection. But their suffering was real, their exploitation systematic, and their fate tragic beyond measure. Can a society really claim moral superiority while hiding something so horrifying behind silk curtains? Even the decline of this practice came not from within, but from outside pressure. Western missionaries visiting China during the late Qing dynasty were appalled. They documented what they saw, and their reports made waves back home. International pressure mounted. When the Republic of China formed in 1911, laws were passed to end concubinage, both male and female, but enforcement spotty at best. In remote provinces, the practice continued for years. Old habits, after all, die hard. Some of the last male concubines simply disappeared into history. Their masters abandoned them to avoid legal trouble. They were left with no skills, no family, no way to survive. Many died in poverty. Others were forced into silence by the political campaigns of later regimes. Some were executed as symbols of feudal decay. Others were re-educated in labor camps. Modern China has done its best to wipe these stories clean. It's a history that clashes with official narratives of virtue, family values, and moral tradition. Researchers who try to study this topic today face enormous barriers. Documents are missing, archives are sealed, even open discussion is discouraged. And yet, these stories matter because they reveal something uncomfortable but necessary: the truth that even the most admired societies can have monstrous underbellies, that cultural elegance doesn't equal ethical purity, and that behind every silk curtain there might be a silent scream. It also reminds us how quickly people can normalize cruelty, how easily society justifies abuse when it benefits the powerful, and how often the vulnerable are treated as disposable. Isn't it important to ask how many other stories have been silenced? If these boys were remembered, not as art pieces, not as scandal, but as human beings, maybe their suffering wouldn't have been in vain. Maybe, just maybe, history could serve as more than a mirror. It could be a warning. If this deep dive into one of ancient China's most haunting secrets shocked or moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video, drop a comment, and subscribe for more history that the textbooks left out. Let's make sure stories like these aren't forgotten.